REDtalks.live, your home of ranting engineers and DevOps. And today we're going to talk about security and what many believe might be its kryptonite, automation. Security and automation coming together, and the perfect guest that I could find to talk about this topic is my colleague, Benn Alp. Ben, say hi to our listeners.
G'day, everybody.
How you doing, Ben? So tell us a little bit about yourself. What do you do? Why are you talking to me about security automation?
For sure. So yeah, I'm a global security architect with F5. I've been with F5 for about coming up on 6 years now, but in the security game for about 17 years, focused on around application security. So done a bunch of enterprise security architecture in financial services before F5, and also fast-moving consumer goods, and actually working for a brewery. But yeah, I'm really passionate about application security.
Fantastic. And if anybody's noticing a similarity in our accents, Ben, like me, is from Australia, which is the correct pronunciation for, as the British would say, Australia. Am I right?
Mate. Yeah, so you grew up in Adelaide, right?
I grew up in Adelaide, and that's why I called it Straya.
Australia.
P-R-A-Y-A, the correct phonetic spelling.
Excellent. Yeah, I'm in Melbourne.
Cool. So, security automation. Where should we start? So, what do people do when you go to talk to them, customers or industry experts, about automating the practice of security?
Yeah, well, I mean, I know that the topic of the show is Red Talks, and R stands for rant, right? So if you'll bear with me, I might have a little bit of a rant about why I find security automation, and also, I guess, security in the context of DevOps, such an interesting topic. And a lot of this goes sure. A lot of this kind of goes to like my own personal experiences when I was doing security architecture in the bank, and also in a lot of other organizations. And one of the kind of things that I've kind of landed on is that application security is like really, really hard to get right. The traditional way and that a modern, like a mature organization would do application security is kind of front-ended and back-ended around the delivery of a particular project. You do a whole heap of work early on in the project, usually at the architectural phase. That's kind of looking at both repeatable architectural building blocks that we would govern a particular project that's delivering to use. When you get to the solution architecture phase, you're doing threat and risk assessments. So looking at all of the likelihood of threats and risks realizing, and recommending controls. And you'd spend a lot of time as part of that kind of governance process of a big monolithic waterfall project on delivering documents. And sometimes you get a bit frustrated that you go through this process, and these documents would be nice and neatly filed away and never to be seen again. And as we've moved to different modes of delivering applications, particularly as you've moved to a more agile methodology, this whole idea of like front-ending a project with lots of higher order governance and a lot of planning before, when we get down to quite a fine level of detail, often a detailed design, before we go out and build an application. That doesn't happen anymore. We're kind of in a world of stand-ups where it wasn't all that effective. And the other area where a lot of organizations focus a lot of their application security is at the very tail end. Before something kind of goes into production, most organizations will do a penetration test. They'll try and identify and try and find vulnerabilities within that application. And as we know, this kind of works for security in general for fixing infrastructure vulnerabilities. Most organizations have got infrastructure vulnerability management pretty under control over, after years of, putting in place practices so that you could roll out patches on time, so that, there was a validation, vulnerability identification process so that you could validate that those vulnerabilities were being remediated. And the way in which a lot of organizations did that is they standardized standard operating environments, used automation and orchestration systems to roll out that at large scale. That's kind of really the only way to solve that problem. But when we're talking about application security, applications, as we know, are in many cases unique snowflakes. There are that many different frameworks that sit out there. Often, when you would find vulnerabilities in an application really late in the process, you're kind of battling with the fact that that might be layer upon layer below at the level that the project, the delivery is operating. You're talking about applications that have got integrations with many other different applications and systems of record. So the level of testing and effort that is required in order to remediate a vulnerability and then roll that into a release, in many cases you're talking like a year plus release cycle. Well, we'll fix that vulnerability in a year plus, then ultimately the risk gets accepted. So that's a particularly challenging thing when it comes to application security in the traditional model, and a lot of the time you kind of end up both delivering these long documents that would describe threats and risks and controls, and finding vulnerabilities, but ultimately the business stakeholder who ultimately owns the security risk in many organizations, they're gold on kind of getting something fast to market, and anybody that's kind of coming to them and adding friction to the process, even in the traditional world of delivery, often it's kind of like quite a negotiation, and there's through risk management processes, there are many risks out there where someone's kind of just signed a deviation or an acceptance of a risk because they want the security organization to go away. So there's a lot of challenges with application security, and it's really, really hard to get right. And there are some organizations out there that are getting it right. But as we've kind of moved from that traditional, and this shift is going to happen over the last couple of years, it started off in business-led IT projects. So often, the business would get frustrated with I've traditionally had to go to IT, and they'll run a big multi-year project and a waterfall delivery, and then eventually by the time it's delivered, my requirements have changed, etc. So what started kind of sprouting up in many of the organizations that I worked in, which were consumer-facing organizations, and it usually started at the business to consumer level, was business-led IT delivering kind of digital projects that were adopting heavy DevOps methodologies, and for the most part, a lot of security organizations kind of were like, oh well, we'll try and apply the traditional way in which we would govern a project to that delivery, that more agile delivery process, which we, as we know, doesn't work. You can't scale to that size. I've seen instances where if we try and put gates in place or forms to fill out, the teams there are actively going to try and bypass those activities because we're just adding friction to the process. I think there's a real opportunity. A lot of security teams are kind of looking at it at the moment and going, well, like a little bit of, we don't know how to deal with this. And I think I see that this movement to faster releases, better understanding of the components that make up an application as an opportunity. It's not something that that we should try and hinder or slow down or put our traditional kind of top-down governance on, which I think there's an opportunity there to develop champions in those teams to move security from being a blocker or a team that adds friction, or as we kind of used to be known, the Department of No, to more of a services team that can offer up things. So that's a little bit of a rant, but like I think this is super exciting space because I don't know, it's happening. It seems to be happening everywhere in the world, but particularly here in Australia. It seems every large organization is going through a transformation of culture and structure, moving away from silos to small tribes or teams that are kind of delivering in a much more using these new delivery methodologies. And if we try and do it the way we used to do it, we're just going to be ineffective. I think that let me finish my one more thing to rant about. I think that we hear a lot about a lot of large exposures of data over the years. Late last year, there was a large number of these exposures of data, and I believe that in every one of those organizations, there is a security team who knew the right thing to do. But it comes down to organizational political reasons as to why there might not be controls in place, or why vulnerabilities that are known might not be remediated. So yeah, I'm hopeful that the DevOps and the DevSecOps movement to kind of break down those silos can kind of start to address some of those organizational political issues as well.
So would you say then to people who kind of weren't really ready for the whole DevSecOps, should they be worried that it's less secure, or just a different way of doing things, or is it potentially more secure, or is it neither of those and it's just a different way of actually being secure?
Yeah, I think that there's probably an evolution. In many cases, where, as I mentioned before, there'll be small teams that are kind of spun off to the side, that are doing things differently. In a lot of cases, they'll be deploying without any consideration for security. They'll just be going as fast as they possibly can. I think that then there's an evolution from there. So security folks going to finally go through acceptance that this is happening in their organization, and start looking at, well, what controls can we start to put in place? And early on in that evolution, there are early on in that evolution, there are things like sorry about that. Early on in the evolution, there are things like you'll start putting static code analysis, helping the developers in identifying vulnerabilities early in the process. You can look at things like software composition analysis. So there's a whole heap of tools that can be built over time into the tool chain to help identify vulnerabilities within software. But as we know, there is no foolproof control. So layered controls is a recommended approach. A lot of the work we've been looking at is how can we layer our compensating runtime controls into the development, into the CD process, so you can deliver something like a web application firewall to find or get the vulnerabilities that can't or haven't been detected by those earlier controls, as well as control advanced threats to applications. So things like credential stuffing attacks, application layer denial of service attacks, man in the browser-based credential stealing, malware. All of these things are threats that applications are exposed to, and you might be able to control those by, as a security team, offering up services that are repeatedly consumable by development teams in a low friction manner. And that's a lot of the work that we've been doing in recent times.
That's interesting. So, and I like the examples you gave there. Like there's the concept of having like a WAF that you put in that's trying to work out if data's being stolen or vulnerabilities are being leveraged in real time. But then what people are starting to do, and actually there's been some really cool stuff out of GitHub, like they do code scanning now of things in repositories and tell you, by the way, you're using like a node module that has got a known issue with it, you should update that node module. So before you even go and put it online, let's just take care of some of those really obvious things that you're not looking at because you're measured against the release of that functionality that's going to improve productivity or generate revenue. You're not measured on, did I go through and look for the entire package.json file and find that one? And developers, are encouraged not to do that because they're measured against the release of the functionalities. So that is interesting that really, though, what I'm looking at there is for the exact same thing. I'm looking at things like, can I do cross-site request forgery? I'm just looking before I push that code to production versus in real time trying to guess if that's what someone's trying to do and intercept and block that behavior. But it's not like that with agile software development and more frequent deployments that suddenly there was a new issue. Actually, a lot of the things are exactly the same. We're just looking in a different way. Would that be a fair thing to say?
Yeah, absolutely. And the more layers that we can, I guess the mantra is that security needs to shift left. We need to get earlier in the development, like identifying vulnerabilities earlier in the development process, not operating as kind of a black box that operates off to the side. There needs to be a feedback loop there so that there is kind of visibility of, vulnerabilities that are identified, threats to an application. And so using things like, as mentioned before, there's a whole heap of open source tools as well as commercial tools out there for doing static code analysis. So, identifying vulnerabilities that are introduced through poor coding practices. Also, a lot of a standard practice in this space is developer awareness. So you can start putting kind of metrics associated with the number of defects that are identified. Start classifying security defects in the same way as functionality defects and managing them through the same process. So by building a lot of these things using automation into the pipeline, we can get better security outcomes.
So onto automation, and the reason that I wanted to get you on this show to share what you've been working on for a while. But first, would it be fair to say, though, that many of the technologies that security professionals have to work with to apply security after the fact, after automated deployment, the problem with a lot of those is that they aren't architected and implemented in a way that supports rapid changes and continuous improvement, which are all the things that we need for a continuous deployment environment. We give people these things and say, yeah, there's the CLI. Now you've got to become an expert in that and be continuously using it without causing any problems and ever typing anything wrong in production. Is that a kind of fair assumption that maybe the tools that they're provided and that are available really aren't ready for the world that they're meant to be securing?
Yeah, I mean, the security industry is coming up to speed, but I would wholeheartily agree that from a tools perspective, it has been an evolution, and we are still at the as an industry at the earlier stages in that process. But it's not just a tooling thing. It's also a cultural thing. It's a cultural thing that, in some of the organizations I've worked in, they have many firewalls. And as part of the delivery of something, the idea that a network ACL provides a lot of security risk control value is probably a little bit overrated. But the idea that I've got to kind of pass a ticket to a team to get firewall rules open and closed, and that only the valve that understands security can open and close firewall rules. I think that's a fallacy. It's about how can you define like the guardrails of what might be a risky behavior versus what might not be a risky behavior, and that way you can kind of step out of the way of that delivery. But still, culturally, this siloed mentality of to get something changed in the security domain, I've got to hand that over to the security team. They push the buttons and then they'll pass the ticket back to us. That's just adding friction. So a lot of the opportunity is like, how do I deliver something that is repeatedly consumed as a service? How can security put a lot more work into building something and providing the automation hooks so that they can kind of step out of the way and not add friction to that process.
That makes sense, and I think, like you said, some of the security industries, the creator of these tools, are providing better capabilities around automation and integration, et cetera. But along with just providing that capability, and with culture change and attitude to want to do things that match these agile delivery mechanisms is also probably the education on the best practices and patterns of how to do that, which is the thing that you've been working on. So tell us a little bit, what have you done? How have you made this easier for people, Ben?
Sure. So I mean, there is a program of work and essentially a program called NetOps, which I know you're very familiar with. And what we wanted to do, a lot of we benefit from the fact that a lot of the foundations of our platform, have for a long time been automatable and orchestratable using the iControl APIs. There's been a lot of work and evolution in providing declarative APIs through Application Services 3. So we benefit just by the nature in terms of our security capabilities of being atop a platform that already has very mature APIs. But what we wanted to do as part of that Super NetOps program is really build an education program around what we've been talking about today, which is how can security teams that are kind of struggling with the mindset change that's required in order to be able to add value and be able to control security risks within agile delivery environments. So we've built an education piece that's available as part of that Super NetOps program, and then how to put that into practice. So while we've got a lot of the building blocks of automation and orchestration, the Super NetOps program in Module 3, there's a lab there based on the great work of a rock star SE, Yossi, who's based out of Seattle, Yossi Rosenblum, who's based out of Seattle. He kind of built the end-to-end in a modular way using webhooks within a CI/CD tool to completely automate the process of the CD part of working within a tool chain in order to deploy our advanced WAF product in this instance, to ensure that no matter what, as soon as a code change was pushed, new environment was instantiated, and those, with the security controls were appropriately applied at the runtime. So that solves a few things. It solves, when as you move down the path of building unit tests, automated testing for everything, you can have assurance that the same controls that are applied, no matter what environment, whether it's the developer's environment or whether it's ultimately in production, are all matching. There's a lot of thought that goes into managing the life cycle of how do I take a particular function like some of the ones that we talked about before, application layer DOS, and kind of wrap this up so that I can offer it up to a developer to be able to be consumed. So I encourage all the security folks out there, I encourage everybody to check that Super NetOps training out, and I think there's a lot of value that can come from being able to break down those silos and increase collaboration using the technology.
That is fantastic news. And for those unfamiliar, Super NetOps is a free online training program designed to enable people who have maybe had their entire career at a user interface, be that a CLI or a GUI, and are wanting to know how to serve new agile development practices of continuous deployment, delivery, integration, all the continuous words that have come out over the last couple of years, and to bring those two worlds together. You can't start going down this path of saying, I want to get continuous delivery and not include everything. It's got to be end-to-end. It's got to be all-inclusive, and awesome people like Ben and Yossi, great shout out there, Yossi in Seattle. Awesome, appreciate your input in all of this. But fortunately, we've got people like Ben Yossi out there doing hard work and making sure that people who look after technologies in the infrastructure are presenting security for applications, so security application services to these development pipelines, and breaking down some of those barriers, allowing us to realize this dream of continuous deployment, but safely. Did I summarize that well?
Absolutely. Sounds good.
Fantastic. We're almost out of time. So I've got one last quick question. What's your dog's name?
Sorry, what was the question?
What's your dog's name?
Oh, Angus. Yes, he features in many video conference calls.
Yeah, I've Bella, the REDtalks.live head of marketing's just
Yes,
out.
I've seen him on a few of the calls.
All about the pets. Well,
Yeah.
any last tips? I mean, other than obviously everyone should just go do the security automation training right now. And anything else you want to leave our listeners with at the end of this episode?
I mean, this is a super exciting space, and it's a space like the where community is key. It's a space where things are rapidly evolving. So I'd encourage everybody to kind of get out there and start talking about this in the security industry. I've noticed over the kind of like the last couple of years that kind of DevSecOps events. We've gone from like a small collection of people to a much larger community, so I'd encourage everybody to get out there and this will evolve over time, keep watching this space.
Cool. So how do people find the course? Should have asked that earlier.
So it's available from f5.com. I think it's you can directly. If you just search for Super NetOps, you can kind of click through. It's module 3 of Super NetOps.
f5.com/super-netops is where you will find that free online training. That was a test, Ben. Time on you. Okay, so you've been listening to Benn Alp, Global Solution Architect, who looks after security at F5 Networks, and me, your host, Nathan Pierce. This has been another episode of REDtalks.live. Thanks for listening.